The Victoria 3 developers revealed everything today in an Ask Me Anything over on Reddit, from military questions to the AI to fun nations to play. In this video, we're going to cover off all of the juicy new details about Victoria 3. But firstly, thank you so much for subscribing. We are actually genuinely maybe going to hit my target of 30,000 subscribers by the release date of Victoria 3 in 2 weeks. Thank you so much. The gameplay in the background is from their most recent live stream. I will link that below. I'd encourage you to go and watch it in full. It is very interesting. But without any mucking about, let's begin. Firstly, they were asked, will the Grand Edition increase in price after launch, and if they have any plans for foreign direct investment in currencies and similar macroeconomic interactions in the game. On the first point, they said no, the price is planned to remain the same. The only thing you've been missing out on by waiting to buy afterwards is the Victoria 2 remastered soundtrack, which is great. And then secondly, they said that while they don't have any plans to add any of those macroeconomic features, foreign direct investment at the moment, he is personally excited to try and cram it in somehow. And it's definitely on the roadmap, though not sure quite how far down it yet. An interesting note on Victoria 3's future, and one that we'll touch on more in a little bit later in the video. Second question, one that I see a lot in the comments on my Victoria 3 gameplay breakdowns. Will there be endgame wars? Probably hinting at World War I, I guess. Or will the Alliance Great Chains organically cause great wars? The answer, reflective not just of Victoria 3, but I would say probably more broadly of the Paradox kind of sandbox, but based on very strongly based on history, grand strategy experience. We don't railroad or script great wars, but alliance chains, claims, unifications, and that kind of stuff does tend to cause larger wars, yes. That's their answer, and in a nutshell, as I say, that reflects their broader design philosophy and mantra. These events aren't necessarily hard-coded in, i.e. you don't hit a year in the game and whoop, bam, there it is, wartime. As such, however, because there's grand alliances, you do tend to end up in grand conflict. The third one, and it is a little long-winded, welcome to pause the video and read it if you want, but let me take you through it in a nutshell. It's about changes to the engine, the base thing that underlies this game, and you might have noticed, looking at things like portraits and maybe the UI tooltips, similar to CK3 and more recent Paradox releases. They say that they're using the same engine as CK3, approximately, depending on times of releases and updates. The engine team are updating to improve it. They go on to talk about how the engine is shared across, so the different game teams are learning and being able to share their designs and strategies across the games. They also mentioned that games from Imperator to CK3 onwards will continue to use the continuously improving Clausewitz engine. How about that? Feature-wise, some of the improvements are the script system, the new GUI system, the portrait system, as I mentioned earlier, and many of you have mentioned in the comments that portraits in this game look like the ones in CK3. There's the answer to that, as well as better rendering systems. Pretty fascinating stuff happening at the back end there, I think. Next up, when did you actually start working on the game? This one is fairly short and sweet. Martin's been the game director since 2018, about a year before then it had been in the works. Basically, they've been working on this for 5 years. Fairly fascinating. Victoria 2, of course, released some 12 years ago with post updates. Next up, is there a way to manually distribute the exact number of battalions, this is of course a question on combat, between generals in the same headquarters? Or is that assigned based exclusively on the number of generals and their ranks? Same question, of course, for flotillas and admirals. Their answer, there is not. Battalions and flotillas are assigned to generals in Victoria 3 and admirals belonging to the HQ or the strategic region in question, with a max depending on their ranks and traits. This we'll talk a little bit later in the video about, but reflects the broader design philosophy behind combat in Victoria 3, which is at the end of the day a political and economic grand strategy simulator at its core, with military coming out from that. Next up, and this one is really in true Pokemon the first movie clone fighting OG fashion. What was the strangest bug you encountered during development? A little bit of a fun one. They said when you would try and launch multiple naval invasions in the same area, your troops would manage to somehow clone themselves and then start a battle. against each other. Kind of a fun breath of fresh air and a brief interlude between some fairly serious questions and some great detail about Victoria 3. Loads of bugs to be encountered. Maybe the spiffing Brit will be able to exploit this one just yet. I have a feeling he probably will be able to exploit something in a game this complex. Moving more towards internal politics, they were asked how hard has it been balancing the interest groups to keep all options interesting and potentially worthwhile. From what we've shown or seen to date, it seems that most playthroughs probably gravitate towards a combination of the intelligentsia, industrialists, and maybe the armed forces. This is referring to the different groups, the different political interest groups inside of a nation. They answer that, and this is quite fascinating, that firstly, of course, it will help to have an authority capacity. This is what allows you to say, enforce new taxes, change laws, maybe push the boundaries a little bit of what might be acceptable in your country. More broadly, though, they say that it's true, of course, that the game pushes you a bit more strongly towards interest groups like landowners, rural folk. One of the reasons is that historical realism. They want the default experience to be that liberalization is challenging. It shouldn't be the status quo, it should be the challenge against the status quo of autocratic power structures, a resource economy, and impoverished peasants, truly fitting of 1836, which, if you don't know, is the starting year for a Victoria 3 playthrough, running through until probably 1936, if you can survive that long. They go on to say that though the latter is of course possible, and in some cases desirable, at least in the short term. So there's a balance here to be struck, there's a historical accuracy, but also plenty of player agency. We've seen them play around with these interest groups a little bit live on stream. You'll see it in this video as they attempt to rebalance their government by pulling in different interest groups and potentially pushing others out, which seems to unlock different laws and policies that are available to them. More to come on that in future, but a really fascinating question with loads of different things to unpack there around internal politics in Victoria 3. Next up, a bit of a spicy one. Do countries change their colour depending on their ideology? I assume referring to the flag. The answer is sometimes, but not always. This answer refers to Portugal. There were other mentions in the AMA to do with, I think from memory, Italy, maybe some others. Portugal is blue but switches to green, if you're wondering, if and only if it becomes a republic, for example. So different conditions there to play around with. Next up, how do you feel the AI is shaping up towards release? This is a big question, of course, for most players who will be experiencing this in single player, I'm sure. Is it able to give the player a significant challenge? And has it been more of a pain to code and balance? What a doozy of a question. They say that the role here is to roleplay and act in accordance with the Vic3 strategies, so the player will know why the AI does what it does. The challenge at the moment is getting it to consider more of those long-term impacts of its actions. It'll happily go ahead to raise taxes to control costs, cancel trade routes, but that may mean it has a much higher chance of revolution later on. In fairness, this can also be the stuff most human players need a few hundred hours to get good at, though, they add at the end. An interesting point around what must be a challenge to code all of these different working nations and features, and I think that a lot of players will be interested to see in practice how that plays out. Next up, a little bit of a short one, but a doozy at the same time. This one is around Wargoals in Victoria 3, but specifically at a wider level around modding. Is there anything that can or can't be modded? Where Wargoals come in is, well, actually, it might be a great example. The one that comes to mind is Wargoals, the thing that can't be modded. They looked into it briefly, but found that there were some technical difficulties that might make it a little bit tricky. But it might not be a big deal due to the fact that modding capacity does seem, or at least we've heard, is going to be fairly wide-reaching across most aspects of the game. And it will depend, of course, on how the modding scene evolves. Something very important to a lot of Paradox games more broadly, thinking Elder Kings, CK3, that kind of thing. Next up, a two-part question, and a spicy one at that. As someone who likes to play smaller countries, which one should I do? And is there any country that you think has a particularly interesting situation? Bring on release day. The Victoria 3 developer answers by saying Japan's not obscure, but it's outside Europe. And it's wild trying to slowly deal with the shogunate and attempt to restore power. We've seen this live on stream. Very fun. Next up, they say, oh, in Bolivia, we have the Peru-Bolivia Confederation as a whole thing in the game. So you have a shot to actually consolidate a decent chunk of the Andes under Bolivian rule. Back on the Japan comment, they said that they've also had devs build surprisingly big empires with Hawaii, another potentially fun minor place to play. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure how they pulled it off, and I wouldn't really recommend it as a first country to play. An important note, if you're just starting to scratch the Victoria 3 itch, thinking about coming in and playing Victoria 3 for the first time when it releases, as a reminder, on the 25th of October. That is the full basic edition public release date. We are getting very close. Speaking of very close, our second last question: have you considered at some point the development of salt or other goods? And were there some that were scrapped? And I think this highlights at a wider level, oh, by the way, they said, yeah, we thought about it, but no, we also thought about literature, dairy, light bulbs. But at that broader level that I mentioned earlier, while this is a grand strategy game, it can't quite, and I would argue shouldn't, scratch every single itch on offer, right? Adopt every single good that it could possibly do. A line has to be drawn to keep it somewhat effective, to keep it running on our computers and manageable for our human minds. And last but not least, another fun one to end on, I think. Which nations are the most fun to play for you personally, and why? Another maybe couple of top tip recommendations. Victoria 3, Prussia and Greece. Prussia, because it's the rising power in Europe, and it's fun to build up an early industrial economy with something massive and scary. We'll see more of that live on stream from them tomorrow if you're watching this on release day. And Greece, mainly because it feels like a clean slate. You can try and focus on a more rural agrarian country. Or you can be crazy and try and rapidly industrialize and hope that your economy doesn't go bankrupt 4 times within the span of 10 years. That one's too close to home. It's great. Thank you very much for watching this video. This has been the Victoria 3 Ask Me Anything on all about everything that we've been wanting to know about Victoria 3. They've, of course, released many developer diaries to cover off the basics, the gameplay basics, and their design philosophy. I'll be covering Victoria 3 as we get closer to its release. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.